Two anglers on the same bank, same lake, same hour, the same water temperature, throwing the same lure at the same fish. One of them lands 9 bass before lunch. The other one lands 2, and spends the whole drive home wondering what he did wrong. Now here is the part that should sit funny with you. Their reels cost almost exactly the same money. One paid a little more, one paid a little less, and the price tag had nothing to do with who filled the lev well. The difference between those 2 mornings came down to 2 numbers. 2 numbers that decide, more than almost anything else you carry, whether the fish ends up in your hand or throws the hook 40 feet out in open water. And those 2 numbers happen to be the 2 the tackle industry is least interested in explaining to you. I have watched people for years walk into a shop, reach for the flashiest reel on the wall, and pay for the one number printed in big bold letters on the front of the box, when the number that actually mattered was hiding in the fine print, or was not on the box at all. So let me hand you the whole thing today. By the time we are done, you will read a reel the way a bass reads your bait, from the inside out, and you will never again pay extra for a number that catches nothing. Let me start with the number they want you to stare at. Gear ratio. You have seen it. 6.2 to 1, 7.1 to 1. On a baitcaster, maybe 8.1 to 1, sometimes higher. It gets printed big because it sounds like horsepower, and a bigger number feels like more reel for your money. Here is the quiet problem with that. A gear ratio, all by itself, does not tell you how fast your reel actually picks up line. It cannot. It is only half of the equation, and it is the less important half. Think of it like a bicycle for a second. Before we touch a single piece of jargon, 2 riders are pedaling side by side, turning the pedals at the exact same speed, same cadence, same effort. One is on a little kid's bike with tiny wheels, the other is on a full road bike with big wheels, same pedaling, wildly different speed down the road because the wheel underneath the gear is a different size. Your reel works the very same way. The gear ratio is the pedaling, the spool is the wheel. And nobody sells you a bike by telling you only how fast the pedals spin. So here is the number that actually matters, and I want you to write it on the back of your hand. Inches per turn. Some brands call it line retrieve per crank. It is exactly what it sounds like. How many inches of line does the reel pull in with one full turn of the handle? That is the real speed of your reel. That is the number the fish feels on the other end. And it is quietly determined by the gear ratio multiplied by how far around the spool is, which is just the width across the spool times a hair over 3. Bigger spool, more line pulled in per turn, even if the gear ratio on the box is smaller. Let me make that concrete, because this is where it clicks. Take a small reel, a 2500 size, with a fast-sounding 6.2 to 1 ratio. A typical one pulls in somewhere around 30 inches of line per crank. Now take a bigger reel, a 4000 size, wearing a slower-sounding 5.2 to 1. That one pulls in closer to 40 inches per crank. Read that again. The reel with the slower, less impressive number on the box is actually the faster reel on the water. The bigger spool did the work the gear ratio got the credit for. 2 reels, same brand even, and the box number told you the exact opposite of the truth. Now sit with what that means for a second. If you have ever bought a reel because it had a higher gear ratio than the one next to it, believing you were buying a faster retrieve, there is a real chance you bought a slower one. And you had no way to know, because the number that would have told you the truth was not the one they put in front of your eyes. And this cuts clean across reel types, so let me save you a translation headache while we are here. On spinning reels, the gear ratios you will see mostly live between about 5 to 1 and a little past 6 to 1. Next to a baitcaster, they look sleepy, because baitcasters climb past 7 and 8 to 1 and keep going. People see those numbers side by side and assume every baitcaster is faster than every spinning reel. It is not true. A baitcaster generally rides a smaller, narrower spool than a comparable spinning reel, which is exactly why it needs a bigger ratio to move the same line. So a loud baitcaster number and a modest spinning number can land in the very same neighborhood of inches per turn. Once you are reading inches per turn instead of ratio, the reel type stops fooling you. You are finally comparing the only thing that catches fish, how much line comes home per crank, and all the marketing language on the front of both boxes just quietly melts away. So why is that? Why is the honest number, inches per turn, tucked into a spec chart online or buried in small print, while the ratio gets the billboard treatment. It is not a conspiracy. It is simpler and more ordinary than that. Inches per turn is an unflattering number for the people selling reels. It exposes things they would rather leave fuzzy. It shows you that a cheaper reel with a bigger spool can out-retrieve a pricier one. It shows you that two reels on the same peg do completely different jobs. And worst of all for the register, it points you toward buying the right size once, instead of buying 3 reels chasing a feeling. A clear number that helps you buy less is a number with no reason to be on the front of the box. That is the first thing the wall will never tell you, and it will not be the last. All right, that is number 1, inches per turn. Let me hand you number 2, because on its own it is worth the price of a fish or two every trip. Reel size. And this is the one almost everybody gets wrong, because the industry taught us to read it wrong. You have seen the sizes: 1,000, 2,500, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, on up. Ask the average angler what those numbers mean, and he will tell you small reel for small fish, big reel for big fish. That is the story the shelf tells. It is also mostly wrong, and it costs people fish every single weekend. Reel size is not a fish size dial. It is a system. It quietly sets 4 things at once, and only one of them has anything to do with how big the fish is. Here is what size actually controls. First, the line it is built around. A smaller size is designed for thinner line, and it holds a sensible amount of it. A bigger size is built for thicker line and more of it. Second, the drag range. Bigger sizes generally give you more room at the top end to pressure a strong fish. Third, and here is the one from a minute ago, the spool diameter, which sets your inches per turn. And fourth, the one nobody thinks about until their forearm is aching, balance. The weight of the reel against the weight of the rod. Let me take those in order, because each one is a fish you are leaving in the water. Line first. If you put a size too large on a finesse setup, you are cramming a spool built for 15-pound line with 6-pound line, and it lays on there loose and sloppy and jumps off in loops on the cast. Go too small for the job and you run out of line on a good run, or you overfill a tiny spool and fight tangles all day. The size is not about the fish. It is about marrying the reel to the line and the line to the way you fish. And here is the variable almost nobody folds in, the one that quietly rewrote all of this in the last 20 years, line diameter. The size stamped on a reel assumes a certain thickness of line, and those numbers were drawn up back in the age of monofilament. Then thin braid arrived, and braid of the same strength is dramatically thinner than mono. All of a sudden a spool built to hold 140 yards of 10-pound mono could swallow 2, even 3 times that length of 10-pound braid. That changes the math of what size you even need. A lot of good anglers are carrying a reel a full size larger than they have to, hauling the extra weight, wrecking their balance, for one reason only: they are sizing for the line their grandfather spooled. Match the size to the actual diameter of the line you run today, and you can very often drop a size, shed the weight, and fish lighter and longer. And notice, one more time, who quietly benefits from you not knowing that. Line sits on one aisle, and reels sit on another, and the interaction between them, the single thing that decides whether your outfit is right, belongs to no display and no salesperson. It falls in the gap between 2 products, which is exactly where the useful truth always seems to hide. Now balance, because this is the one that quietly steals the most from you and never gets discussed. A rod and reel is a lever. When the weight of the reel sits right against the weight of the rod, the whole thing hangs neutral in your hand, and the balance point falls right about at your reel foot. You barely feel it. You can cast it 300 times in a morning, and your wrist never files a complaint. Bolt a reel that is too heavy onto a light rod, and the whole outfit tips forward. And now every single cast and every twitch of the rod tip is fighting a seesaw. It does not feel like much on cast number 10. On cast number 200, it is the reason you quit early, and quitting early is the reason the evening bite happened without you. That is free. That costs you nothing but paying attention, and you will not find it on any box, because tired forearms do not have a skew. Let me hand you 2 things you can do tonight, at the kitchen table, that will teach your hands more than any spec chart ever printed. First, the balance test. Take any rod and reel you own, line and all, and lay it across one finger, sliding your finger along until the whole thing hangs dead level, neither end dipping. Wherever your finger lands, that is your balance point. If it sits right around the reel foot or the front of the grip, that outfit is going to feel weightless all day long. If your finger has to slide way out onto the blank before it hangs level, the reel is too heavy for that rod, and your wrist is going to pay the tax on every single cast. You just diagnosed a whole setup in 10 seconds, with no tools, and nobody sold you a thing. Second, and this is my favorite quiet upgrade in all of fishing, the handle. The handle on your reel is a lever, and lever length is leverage. A longer handle arm gives you more cranking power for the same effort, which is a real advantage when you are dragging a big deep crankbait or winching a good fish up out of heavy cover. A shorter handle trades that grunt for a faster, tighter, snappier feel. Most reels let you swap the handle for a few dollars, and a longer power handle can turn a reel that felt like it was straining into one that pulls big baits like they weigh nothing, and you never spent a cent on a new reel. There is no marketing campaign for a $10 handle swap. It does not move a flagship off the wall, so it stays a secret in plain sight, passed hand to hand between people who actually fish, which is the only place a lot of the good information has ever traveled. One more thing the size number quietly sets, the drag. A bigger size generally hands you a wider drag range at the top, more maximum stopping power on paper. That sounds like a reason to size up, and the box would love you to read it exactly that way. But raw maximum drag is another number that flatters and misleads. You will almost never touch a reel's top-end drag, because your line breaks long before you get anywhere near it. The drag that actually matters is the one you fish, a smooth quarter to a third of your line's breaking strength, set so it gives before your knot does. A modest reel matched to your line will protect you on a screaming run just as surely as a monster with a huge number stamped on the side. Size for the line and the job, and the drag range takes care of itself. Chase the biggest maximum drag figure on the shelf, and you are paying, yet again, for a number the fish will never once make you use. And while we are on the spool, let me give you the honest version of the casting distance story, because the marketing version runs hot. Yes, a larger, wider, well-machined spool lets your line peel off in bigger, smoother coils, with less of it dragging against the lip, and that does buy you a little distance. It is real, it is also small, and it is close to the last thing that should decide a purchase. The angler who casts farther is almost never the one who paid for the fancier spool. He is the one who filled his spool to the right level, close to the lip but not over it, throwing line that is fresh instead of coiled and tired. Both of those are free. An overfilled spool throws loops and wind knots on every cast. An underfilled spool drags each cast short. Fresh line jumps off the reel like it wants to go. Old line comes off like a spring toy. You will outcast a more expensive reel any day of the week with the cheaper one filled correctly and freshly, and that fix costs you nothing but a few quiet minutes at the kitchen table. I want to be straight with you about something here. None of what I am telling you sells a reel. There is no patent on match the size to your line. Nobody can bottle balance your outfit and stack it on an end cap in spring. It cannot be repackaged next season in a new color with a new name. That is exactly why you have heard the gear ratio talk 100 times, and this maybe never. It is not that it is secret, it is that it is worthless to everyone except you and the fish. Let me put the third piece on the table, because size and inches per turn only matter once you understand what speed is even for. And most of the internet has this backwards too. People will tell you a high-speed reel catches more fish. It sounds right. Faster reel, faster fishing, more fish. But speed is a tool, not a virtue. And using the wrong one at the wrong time is how good anglers get outfished by patient ones. Here is what is really happening down there, and it is worth understanding, because once you see it, you will pick your speed on purpose instead of by accident. When a bass eats a moving bait, it does not bite it the way you would bite an apple. It inhales it. Peter Wainwright, a professor at the University of California, Davis, who has spent his career studying how fish feed, has shown that predatory fish like bass feed by suction. The fish drops its jaw, and flares its gills so fast that it creates a vacuum, and the water, and whatever is floating in that water, gets pulled into the mouth in a fraction of a second. It is violently quick. The whole event is over, almost before your eyes register the swirl. So think about what that means for you standing on the bank. The strike itself is not something your real speed controls. That happens in milliseconds, and it is the fish's decision, not yours. What your real speed controls is everything around that instant. It controls how fast you can move a bait through the zone where the fish is willing to commit. And it controls how fast you can pick up the slack line between you and the fish once it has eaten, so that when you sweep the rod, the hook actually drives home instead of just dragging loose line through the water. That second one is the quiet fish killer, and it gets worse the farther you cast. Picture a fish that eats your bait 40 yards out. Between your rod tip and that fish there is a long, lazy belly of line lying on the water. You set the hook. On a slow reel with low inches per turn, a big part of your hook set is spent just gathering that slack, and by the time the line comes tight, the fish has already felt the sting and opened its mouth. On a reel that picks up a lot of line per turn, you gather that slack in a heartbeat, and the hook point is in bone before the fish knows what happened. Same angler, same hook, same fish. The reel that eats line faster is the one that lands it. This is the real reason the high-speed reel earned its halo, and it came out of the tournament world. Kevin Van Dam, one of the most decorated bass anglers in American history, built a huge part of his reputation on fast, aggressive reaction fishing, burning lures back and catching up to fish that other anglers never got tight to. That is real, and it is a genuine edge in the specific situation it is built for. Fast water, reaction baits, long casts, fish that hit and run. The mistake the industry made, and passed on to you, was quietly dropping the words in the specific situation it is built for, and letting you believe faster is just better everywhere. Because it is not. There is a whole world of fishing where a slow reel is the smarter reel, and a fast one actively costs you fish. Drag a deep crankbait that needs to dig into the bottom and stay there, and a high-speed reel will rip it up out of the strike zone before it ever does its job. A slower reel keeps it down where the fish are. Work a bait that only draws strikes when it barely moves, and speed is your enemy. Fish cold water, when everything down there has slowed to a crawl, and a fish will not chase, and a fast retrieve just pulls the meal away from a mouth that was thinking about it. In all of those, the patient angler with the slower reel quietly outfishes the fellow who paid extra for the big ratio number. Speed is not better. Matched is better. And there is a cost to speed that the big ratio number on the front will never whisper to you. Gearing is a trade, always. The same handle turn that brings in more line brings it in with less raw power. The way a bicycle in its highest gear is a rocket on flat ground and a heartbreak going up a hill. A very fast reel gives you speed and quietly takes away low-end grunt. So the day you finally hook the fish of the season on a burner reel and try to haul it up out of the timber, it can feel weak and buzzy in your hand, because you bought the top gear and left the climbing gear back at the store. This is exactly why so many experienced anglers settle on a medium ratio for the reel they reach for most. It gives up a sliver of top speed and a sliver of grunt to be genuinely good at both, and good at both is what fills a live well across a whole season, instead of shining in one flashy situation and letting you down in the rest. So now you have the whole picture. Inches per turn is your true speed. Size sets your line, your drag, your speed, and your balance. And speed itself is a tool you aim at a job, not a bragging right. Let me put it all together into something you can actually walk to the water with, because this is the part you can use on your very next trip, with the rods you already own. Let me hand you the matches. For panfish, crappie, trout, light finesse, the places where feel is everything and the line is thin, you want a small reel, a 1000 or a 2500, and honestly the exact ratio barely matters here because you are not burning anything. You want light, you want balanced, and you want just enough line pickup to stay tight. For all-around largemouth bass on spinning gear, jigs, worms, soft plastics, a 2500 to a 3000 in a medium-speed retrieve is the reel that quietly does 80% of everything and asks for nothing. When people ask me for one reel to own, it lives right in there. Now for the moving baits, the reaction stuff, spinner baits, lipless cranks, anything you want to burn to trigger a chasing fish. That is where you reach for the higher inches per turn, a faster ratio, a reel that gathers line in a hurry. For deep crankbaits that need to stay pinned to the bottom, flip it, go slower, lower inches per turn, and let the bait do its work in the zone. Walleye, especially when you are dragging or working a bait slowly and reading the bottom by feel, tend to reward a smaller, lighter, slower, well-balanced setup over a fast one. And when you step up to pike, catfish, big river fish, or you head to the surf, now the bigger sizes earn their keep, 4,000, 5,000 and up. Not because the number is bigger, but because you finally need the thicker line, the deeper spool, and the wider drag range that size was built to give you. Let me get more specific, because specifics are what you can actually act on this weekend. Working a jerkbait, where you snap the rod tip and take up slack in a rhythm, rewards a reel with healthy inches per turn, so you can gather that slack cleanly between twitches, and a 2,500 to 3,000 handles it beautifully. A finesse rig crawled slow along the bottom wants the exact opposite, a lighter, slower, well-balanced small reel that lets you feel every pebble the bait ticks across. A swim bait or a bladed jig you are steadily rolling wants a plain medium retrieve, nothing dramatic, matched to the speed the bait swims best. And for the walleye crowd dragging or bottom bouncing, the folks at In Fisherman have long made the case that the numbers back up, that a smooth, moderate, well-balanced reel that lets you drag slowly and read the bottom by feel will outproduce a fast reel almost every time, because walleye fishing is a game of patience and feel, not speed. Every one of these is a small adjustment you can make with reels sitting in your price range right now, not a reason to open your wallet. Notice something about that whole list. Almost none of it required you to spend more money. It required you to spend the right money in the right place. And here is the second thing the wall will never volunteer. Once you match size and speed to what you actually do, you discover you were sold reels to cover gaps that never existed. The 3-reel arsenal a lot of us carry is often 2 reels doing the same job badly, and 1 doing nothing at all. A person who understands these 2 numbers usually needs fewer reels, not more, and the ones he owns are cheaper and matched instead of expensive and guessed at. There is no growth in teaching people to buy less, so the teaching does not happen. The number that would set you free is the number that stays off the box. So let me turn that straight into money left in your pocket. If you fish mostly freshwater and you want to cover almost everything you will ever throw, you do not need a wall of reels. You need 2. 1 light spinning reel in the 2,500 range, balanced on a medium or medium-light rod, matched to light line, for finesse, for panfish, for the slow presentations, for the days when feel is the whole game. And 1 workhorse in the 3,000 to 4,000 range, on a medium or medium-heavy rod, matched to heavier line, for everything with some muscle in it, the moving baits, the bigger fish, the wind. Those 2 outfits, each chosen for the right inches per turn and the right size, will outfish a shopping cart full of mismatched reels, and they will leave enough behind for a tank of gas and a fresh spool of line. That is your reel arsenal, not 10 reels chasing 10 box numbers, 2 reels that know exactly what their jobs are. So let me give you the way to never get fooled again, right there in the aisle, no matter what the badge says or what it costs. Flip the box over, or pull up the spec chart on your phone, and find inches per turn or line retrieve per crank. That is your reel speed. Ignore the big ratio on the front until you have that number. Then look at the size and ask yourself one honest question. What line am I going to put on this, and what am I going to do with it? Match the size to the line and the job, not to the fish in your daydream. Check that the reel feels balanced on the rod you will actually pair it with. Right there in the store, hand on the reel foot, see where it wants to tip. Do those 3 things and a $60 reel and a $600 reel line up on the only things that catch fish, and the 4 figures of difference turn out to be paying for smoothness and polish, which are lovely and which no fish has ever noticed. And if the number is not listed anywhere, which happens on plenty of the cheaper reels, you can find it yourself in about a minute, and this is exactly the kind of thing the wall would rather you never learn to do. Reel your line up to a normal fishing level. Measure straight across the top of the spool, edge to edge, in inches. Multiply that by a hair over 3 to get the distance around the spool, then multiply that by the gear ratio printed on the reel. That number, near enough, is your inches per turn. Now you can stand between two unlabeled reels nobody bothered to spec out and know, cold, which one is truly the faster reel, armed with a tape measure and grade school arithmetic. No badge required. No salesperson required. Just you and the only number that was ever going to catch you a fish. Now I want to hand you something to argue about, because I could be wrong for the way you fish, and I would rather you think than nod. Here is the stake in the ground. For the large majority of freshwater anglers, the high-speed reel is oversold, and most people would catch more fish with a medium retrieve and a properly matched size than with the fastest reel on the shelf. I think the ratio race sold a lot of people a solution to a problem they did not have. Tell me where that falls apart for you. If there is one reel size you would grab if you could only own a single spinning reel for the rest of your life, put it in the comments and tell me why, because that one answer teaches the next angler more than any spec chart ever will. I read them, and the good disagreements end up shaping the next video. Before you go, 2 honest housekeeping notes, because this channel does not do fairy tales. Everything I told you about how reels are built and what the numbers mean comes from the reels themselves, and from the people who study how fish feed, not from a marketing sheet, and the specific inches per turn figures for your exact reel are published by the manufacturer, so trust the spec chart for your model over any round number I use to make a point. And whatever you fish for, and wherever you fish for it, the rules on seasons, limits, and legal methods are yours to know before you launch. Check your state and local regulations every time. They change, and they change by the water you are standing on. If you want all of this in one place, the inches per turn ranges, the size to species matches, the line diameter guide, and a few things there was not room for here, I put it in the Forbidden Lures blueprint. It is a free download. The link is the first one in the description, and the little code stays in the corner of the screen if you would rather scan it. No wall, no email, no catch. It is yours because a well-matched angler is the whole point of this channel. Now go flip a box over, find the reel number, and go put it to work. I will see you on the water.